everyone, welcome to an exciting and unusual episode of ARG Presents. I am Amigo Aaron, joined by a man that normally I will put over and expostulate on his virtues, but today I'm going to pound him like a nail. I give you the BRENT.
Unfortunately, Aaron, you are a hammer made of Play-Doh.
Take off. You're gonna be hurting for certain. So, folks, if you missed last week's exciting episode, and some of you did, we spun the wheel. We made the deal. This is quite a deal this week, as for the first time ever on ARG Presents, with much ballyhoo and nothing but nonstop praise for the idea, we'll be doing ARG Battle. Wah, 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 wah. BRENT,
That's right.
Without giving away the premise of the battle, tell these people, what is ARG Battle?
You know what? I'm going to give away the premise of the battle.
No, don't do that. Just explain the battle.
No. It's NES versus DOS.
Boom.
87, 89.
You're right. It is.
We are opening the debate. When we were growing up, I always said that console gaming, especially during the NES era, was superior to all forms of gaming across all game types. And Aaron completely said no.
No.
He said it is all about computer.
That's right. That's true.
And today we are putting this to rest, and we are going to decide once and for all, during the US NES run, which was better, the Nintendo Entertainment System or MS-DOS for your gaming needs.
That's right. Now, there were certain parameters we set up for this, and we've got a sort of a predetermined way we're going to go through this battle. We're not just going to scream at each other for a half hour. We're going to do this in proper, sort of like a duel. There's got to be rules to the duel. And we've got rules here, and we're gonna go through this, and we've got this split up in a certain way. It should be a interesting battle. I will say that when we talk about DOS versus NES, we mean an MS-DOS PC computer. In the case of today's battle, I'm going to be using as an example the exact computer I had at this exact time, which was, again, 1987, 1989. Of course, BRENT will be using the NES system. BRENT, anything you want to talk about in the preamble of this battle before we go ahead and start talking about the hardware?
I just want to express that I feel sorry that we didn't get into the Super Nintendo era, which I believe was the peak of gaming, but I will have a solid weapon in the NES lineup.
Yeah.
So I'm good to go.
Well, we'll see about that. So, BRENT, according to your predetermined cool guy mythology to run this situation, we are going to go into a hardware discussion here, which makes sense. We're going to talk about the hardware.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the hardware we were using. Why don't I go ahead and let you start this off, and then I will be issued some rebuttal time after this hardware. You ready to go on this?
I am ready to go.
All right. Here.
Let's talk about a little bit of NES hardware. First of all, I'm not going to go into system specs. I don't think that's what this is about. I never think that. It's all about the accessories and the availability of items for your Nintendo and what you could really do to run your system. For me, of course, I had a Nintendo in the US region, but this is really true for the Famicom in Japan and the EU release of the Nintendo, which looks a lot like ours. Number one thing that gives the Nintendo the edge over all other gaming has to be the NES controller. And this controller is something that was so prized for its functionality and its responsiveness that the copyright rode for many, 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 many years. So much so that the competitors said, this D-pad is so awesome, Nintendo, that we're going to basically license it from you. So the Nintendo Pad, one of, if not the best input devices for a gaming system, really even into the 90s. Not this particular gamepad, of course, but others just like it. The Crosshair D-directional pad was just so smooth and so responsive to so many things. It really helped gaming go on. Of course, if you didn't like the D-pad, you always had the option to go with a joystick for Nintendo. The NES Advantage really brought that joystick arcade action home. It was very accessible, nice big buttons, really fluid stick. It's not something that everyone had. I personally actually used a Capcom fighting stick during this era, but any stick that you could get for the Nintendo, either first party or on third party, great stuff. Also for the Nintendo, you had the Zapper. Now, of course, in modern times, the Zapper is not something that you are going to use on modern televisions due to the technology. And the Zapper was not as good as some of its arcade counterparts, of course. But for the home systems, it was a accurate shooter that allowed you to have some of that arcade shooting action at home. Something else that the Nintendo did was allow you to do 4-player action. And not only did it allow you to do 4-player wired action, but they had attachments to let you do 4-player wireless action, which allowed not only just for your 4-player stuff, but your single-player and 2-player stuff as well. This is stuff that no one else was doing at the time. You know, this really allowed you to get some space in between you and your television without the wires. And of course, nowadays, almost all of our equipment is wireless. So this was certainly not the first. I'm not claiming that, but Nintendo did it among the best. And you've also got some of your other playful things, your power pads, your power gloves, all of this stuff. While not the best hardware for sure, it was something that allowed you to experience gaming through different means, your hands, your feet. And that was just not something you would get from a lot of different platforms. And then you had your crazy gimmicks outside of Nintendo's real touch. Stuff like the Miracle Keyboard to learn piano from. In Japan, they even had stuff like karaoke you could do for your Nintendo. All hardware that attaches to your system, that upgrades your system, that allows it to do things it didn't do before. Even very early on, they had 3D systems over in Japan, and they had disk drives to allow you to save different games and different allowed you to expand upon the cartridge. And something I bet you didn't know, Aaron, the Nintendo even had a modem that would allow you to attach their networks and do some of the business side. It allowed stock exchange. It even allowed gambling over in Japan. And unfortunately, the infrastructure was never there for the American system, but that doesn't stop that it was there and very important. So I have to wonder, Aaron, can your hardware do all of that?
Well, if you allow me just a moment, let's start off with this. What country are we in right now?
We're in America.
Now, are we in Japan?
I mean, we could very easily get Japan stuff.
Literally half of what you talked about is disqualified. There was no modem. There was no disk drive. There wasn't any of that stuff. The Nintendo couldn't do any of that in the States. All right? So the virtual reality, that's glorious, but this doesn't exist. Not in the States. So you can throw all that out. All right? Now let's talk about, you're not a specs guy, but I am. So let's just talk about the overall potential of the NES. A 2K onboard RAM and a MOS 6502 running at right around 1.8 megahertz. All right, and we'll compare that to a PC shortly. But I can tell you, it comes up exceedingly short in terms of the overall capabilities of the deck. Now let's talk about the actual American NES. The console wasn't called a console here, it was the Power Deck, because they wanted to differentiate it from video games to make it more VCR-like. That's always the story you hear. And this thing, this particular version of the NES was very flawed, with a horrible mechanism for inserting cartridges that wore out quickly, and that instituted the old blow in the cartridge slot gimmick that we still know to this day because people still do it because of the horrible implementation of this particular connector. Now, I have an NES, and it, of course, when I got it, of course, it had this problem, and it had to be rectified. And eventually, I had to get an engineering change just to make the actual console more usable because when it shipped back in the day, it was a flawed design. I don't think anybody would fight me on that. The multitude of controllers, I believe that wireless setup was infrared, wasn't it, at the time? Which those are well known to be garbage. So I don't think there's a whole lot of people that are going to be playing wireless on their NES. And the cartridge, while I'll give you that the light gun was a fabulous peripheral, the actual controller itself, while being clever in its design with the cross and the two buttons, I've always found it to be very difficult to hold. It's not ergonomic in any way. And it was thankfully they improved upon it because they saw the shortcomings of it pretty early on. And I also would submit to you that the choices of controller on the original NES, especially from 87 to 89, were limited. There were not a ton of different options. The NES Advantage, which I have one of these, is not a good controller. Frankly, it's not good. The joystick's not good, and so for a true joystick experience, it's not the way I would go. There also really aren't any analog options for the NES, but of course they really wouldn't need them because they didn't have any games that supported analog. So there were plenty of shortcomings with the original NES from a hardware perspective, my opinion.
Well, let's take a look at some of what you said. First of all, if you discount, even if you discount the Famicom from Japan, which I think is a silly thing to do, it is still an era of gaming. It was still something you could theoretically get and use, and there are tons of them in the United States even today.
There were tons in 87, 89.
But let's back up and let's just say, was the loading system for Nintendo flawed for the time? It was certainly not the best. You can't debate otherwise. However, you could buy, it eventually went to, you could buy top loaders in the United States. They at least saw the problem and rectified it.
After 89.
Now, if you're talking
about 87 to 89 here. So during this period, you were stuck with these flawed NES decks.
They weren't flawed. Here's something else you have to remember about Nintendo. They 100% supported what they sold. If your Nintendo had a failure, you could take it to a authorized dealer, and if it was inside the warranty zone, bam, fixed, no questions asked. And the repairs on these were pretty cheap. They were pretty cheap for the time.
How much were they?
They ran those repairs. They were less than half the cost of the console to get a new deck. And they ran those repairs. They provided those repairs all the way up until the 2000s, and it's because there was a demand for them. And the only reason why they stopped offering repairs from the Nintendo was they actually ran out of parts. So people were repairing these things into the past 2000s. Now, for the controller, and I see this from a couple different sources, and I mind completely blown. Anyone who doesn't think that the Nintendo controller was one of the best controllers for its time is mind-boggling. Look how many times it was copied, not only during when it was used, but even today. The D-pad is a staple of a controllers.
The D-pad's not the issue. It's the rectangle. The rectangle is garbage.
It's not
it was
garbage.
not ergonomically correct. It
It
made
was
your hand
small.
cramp to
It was
hold.
absolutely small for large hands. There's no question about that. And they did eventually introduce the dog bone shape, which was a little bit easier, which more resembled a Super NES controller. But for the time that it was out, unless you had monstrous hands, which I will fully admit is not ergonomical for monstrous hands, it was still a controller that all other controllers mimicked since its release.
Not all controllers. And let's also, while we're on the subject of controllers, let's talk about this, as you termed it, fun, like a Nintendo track and field pad. We had one of these, and calling that fun would be a gross understatement, or it was not fun. Gross overstatement. This thing was, we hardly ever used it the way you were supposed to, because it was ridiculous trying to use it. And so tell them what we ended up doing. That we ended up getting on our knees and just smacking the pad with our hands, because no one in their right mind is going, you can't run on this thing. Much like the robot that came with the original set, this was a silly, like unused item in the NES controller area.
Rob
so I wouldn't give this thing a lot of billing. It's not like this thing was awesome or anything, because it was not.
Rob was a marketing ploy to get into the North American market.
Not my
and
problem.
Nintendo,
was he good? No.
Did I say Rob was good?
Well, I'm just saying.
And to be fair, the power pad was an option. It is nice to have options. Even though you didn't use the power pad, I certainly used it some. I did I use it as much as the Zapper or the controller? Of course not. But I also didn't have access to as many games that actually used the power pad. Maybe I would have if I'd have had more options.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, I think we can move along from the NES hardware perspective. I'd like to talk about the PC side of this a little bit, if I may, Brentster, because I went ahead and based. Now, listen, we know in the echelon, in the galaxy of personal computers, unlike an NES, for example, you've got choices from here to doomsday as to what your options are. But to be fair, to play fair with this, I'm going to use the actual the hardware options and everything, the pluses and minuses that came with that from the computer we had, which was the Tandy 1000 TL. Unlike Brent, I am going to get into some specs here. This computer had a 286 CPU, 80286, running at 8 megahertz, which right there, if you could recall that the NES was running like 1.2. This also had the option for a math coprocessor, which we didn't have. 5 expansion slots, and the Tandy provided you with a built-in GUI interface, plus some built-in DOS commands, so you didn't have to load them off disk. Ours had a 3.5-inch floppy drive in it, and I want to talk just briefly about the Tandy TL and what it was. And I will say, the 8-bit guy did a great show on the Tandy 1000 series, and just to summarize it, Tandy was basically cloning the PC Junior that was supposed to be all the rage that was coming out. Well, the PC Junior was horrible, and it failed horribly. But Tandy had already done all this work, and they were like, well, heck, let's go ahead and just keep the ball rolling on this thing and make this thing a true DOS PC, and they did. And so what carried over from the PC Junior side of things is the integrated motherboard. In the old days, motherboards were not integrated at all. You had to add your controllers, your ports on the back. You had to add any sort of sound. You had to add a video card. It was all add-on stuff with ISA slots. And the Tandy series added all these things together to make them a much cheaper deal than what you would pay for a PC without this stuff integrated into it. Unlike the 2K Brent's machine has, this thing came with a robust 640K, which was sort of the standard of the time. Now, I will say, we were very lucky in the era of the late 80s to have a Tandy, because the advantages of having the Tandy was you had 16 color video roughly like an EGA equivalent, and you also had 3-voice sound, which was a boon at the time. You've got to remember the ad-lib card, which was the first card to give you PC sound that was widely distributed, came out in '87, and the first Sound Blaster, the first generation of the actual Sound Blaster, came out in '89. They had a thing called the Game Blaster that came out earlier, but it wasn't as robust. And even VGA debuted in the late '80s. So this was having Tandy 16-color graphics was quite a boon back in the day, and it was well supported because a lot of games were more than happy to throw in Tandy graphics and sound. Moby Games has Tandy graphics appearing in almost 1,000 games of that era. So you've got quite a bit of support for the machine back in those days. Now, a PC. What would having a PC get you? Okay, what it got us was, aside from the stuff I've just mentioned, we also had a modem in ours. Now, the modem would allow. This isn't Japan either. This is the USA. The modem would allow us to call bulletin boards or online services and be able to communicate with them, which opened up a whole world of additional interest. Now, let's talk about why having a PC, hardware-wise, is better than a console just straight out of the gate. Just to list a few things. Number one, PC capabilities have nothing to do with gaming. When you buy a PC, you've got access to word processors, spreadsheets, databases. You've got access to email and online messaging. Like I said earlier, connecting to online BBSs and other services. There's educational options and also typing tutors and whatnot, and even art and photo programs. And I will say, just to be fair, the Tandy shipped with all these built in. It came with the discs to run each of these items that I mentioned. So these weren't things you had to buy extra. They were part of the deal. Something else you got with a PC that you didn't get with a console. Of course, a PC has a 102-key keyboard. So right out of the gate, this opens up a whole world of advanced gaming options that you could never do on an NES. Something else that we had, the TL was the first computer that I ever had that had a mouse, that giving you the option for mouse-based gaming or that analog input support that is nice. You had a large choice in controller options. You had flight sticks, game pads. You had joysticks of all kinds made by 100 different companies or more. You even had options in terms of the type of game ports you had. The Tandy series had two built-in joystick support, joystick ports that could house a the types of joysticks made for that port. But a normal PC port, which were a couple, they were less than $50. That had a what was the standard PC gamepad support, would open up a whole world of different options, even stuff like steering wheels and flight yokes, the whole 9 yards. You also have with the PC the ability to upgrade your video and audio options. Even with the Tandy TL, despite the fact that we were really at the front of the pack when it came to graphics and audio, we could have actually upgraded the video or the audio when those cards came available. So you've got an upgrade path. Just like you have an upgrade path with the memory and the processing power. And then lastly, with a PC, you have access to PC software as opposed to cartridges. So what makes this good? Well, for one thing, PC software, and we'll get into this more later on, but PC software was fairly inexpensive compared to the consoles. You also had access to a whole boatload of free software through shareware, through freeware gaming, demos. You also had access to games you could type in yourself. You could get free games like that. You had an ease of use in gaming. A lot of people think that PC gaming was a difficult task with a lot of installing and drivers. Well, in this era, PC gaming was super simple. You got to remember that the Tandy had no hard drive, so everything I played came right off the disc. And usually you just ran stuff right off the disc. There was no install. There was really no memory issues either at this point. It was all much simpler than it later became. You've also got the ability to play networked gaming. And this is an option that lets you hook two computers together. And it worked. Or also play over the modem. I had plenty of games that did this. Having a PC with a modem also gives you the ability to play online games, door games, MUDs, pay services through big pay service game options. You also more frequently than NES, you had the ability to save games. You had a larger, more broad software library, and the software library was free of restrictions, which we'll get into that later. You also had the ability to have adult games or adult-themed games that you wouldn't have access to on an NES because of restrictions. You had the ability to make your own games if you wanted to, and you had the skill. You also had the ability to download games from online services. So you had a lot of options in the PC world that you could never have had in the world of the console. What do you think, Brent?
Well, first of all, we really need to work on your concept of 5 minutes, but that's neither here nor there.
That was 5 minutes. That was 5 minutes.
Let's go ahead and talk about some of the things you brought up here.
Please.
First of all, you have, of course, avoided cost altogether. Because we know that cost isn't even on the same playing field.
You didn't mention the cost on yours, so I didn't mention it on mine.
Okay, sure. We'll go with that. And then you started talking about all of these wonderful things you could email, and you could do this, and you buy this card, and then you have this ability, and you buy that card, and you have this ability. I don't want that. I want a game machine that when I buy my game, I stick it in and it works. And that, now granted, during this era, it was closer, but it was certainly not something where anything you got, you just plugged in and it started working. You talked about the inputs. Most computers, and I can't 100% for sure say if Tandy did this or not, most computers did not ship with any kind of joystick or anything. It shipped with a keyboard. So as we know, software manufacturers will go with the lowest common denominator, which meant most of your games were gaming off of a keyboard, which personally I don't think is a pleasurable experience. I think there are games that work with keyboards if you want to play text adventures. I think PCs are definitely the way to go. But literally all the rest of gaming, and I'm talking about adventure, strategy, role-playing, and we'll get more into this on the software side, is better suited and more streamlined for console. Now, on to more hardware stuff. You were talking about the processor, 8 megaflops, blah, blah, blah. It's because PCs have so much overhead that they have to work with. And all the RAM you were talking about, all the RAM that was needed for the Nintendo was on the carts. That was the whole point. That way, if a game needed more space, it would put on more chips, and it allowed the expandability through that. When you put in a floppy disk, or you're playing your game and you get to the point and it's like put in disk 2, well, there goes the flow of gaming. So you've got to fumble out, get your disk out, put it in, hope it still works, because magnetic media is the devil. And thankfully, we've went away from that for a large part in floppy form. Also, with PC gaming, you're talking about all this online stuff, right? Online availability, especially during this time, was so limited. It was so limited. You had to, at best, if you lived somewhere that you had a BBS in your area, you were lucky. You had someone you could call into, you were lucky. So using that as a selling part for hardware is just as silly as me saying that you could use a modem in Japan. So you're talking about an era that is before online capabilities, and I know there were BBSs out there during this time, but they weren't nearly as prevalent as you're wanting to make them out to be. It was a hard job to get into a BBS during this time. So also hardware. One more thing I want to mention. I know I'm running out of time here. Is you were talking about different peripherals, and then at least you mentioned it. almost none of this stuff would plug into your computer directly. You had to buy a gaming port of some sort to get your good analog and your flight sticks or your steering wheels. And it's just cost after cost after cost, which is what, unfortunately, PC gaming was and what it is now.
If I may rebut just for a brief moment.
Absolutely.
You're totally incorrect about the online situation. We live in a remote death hole of West Virginia, and they were in 87, 80. This was the prime time for BBS. It never got any better. This is it. There were 20 boards locally to me. That's the discounting things like CompuServe and whatnot, where these Prodigy, these huge services that you could call and play these massive games. So if you think that there wasn't any sort of BBS action, and let's not discount stuff like FidoNets and also emailing and stuff through these big services. There was international email available at this time. There was international messaging, and there was tons and tons of BBSing, board games, MUDs. That was all. This was the prime time. So no, this isn't like Japan. This is an actual thing. And our machine came with a mode. I'm sure you're there. Now, I will grant you, when you have to get into this era in gaming on PCs, 87, 89, is a little quirky because it sort of predates when the Sound Blasters and the ad-lib cards were becoming widely accepted. Shortly thereafter, I'd say in 91 or so, where Sound Blaster sort of became the ipso facto audio source, every audio card came with a standard joystick port. So I'll grant you, I would submit to you that yes, this era was a little more. You had to actually get if you want a Tandy at least, you had to go out and buy a joystick card for $25 or whatever. Like I said, we're lucky the Tandy came with joystick ports, and yes, you're also right that they did not ship with joysticks, so that would be something else you had to buy for $30 or whatever. Go out and get some joysticks, but in just a few short years, this would be pretty much off the table in terms of that. There was no overhead in gaming or memory waste because again, this predates a Windows era. What you got in DOS is what you had. There was no overhead, just for maybe a mouse drive or something like that, but that's it. So you're getting all that memory. The Tandy, of course, had the graphics and sounds built in, so you didn't have to actually do anything to get this stuff. You didn't have to go and buy extra cards. They were there. 16 colors, glorious, colorful video with sound, with good sound up to 5 channels when they did it right. So I don't agree with the majority of what you said, specifically the BBS parts, which can't be understated. That's the one thing you could definitely do on a PC you could never do on an NES in America, is play online games with your friends, which means something. So, with all that said, let's move on to the software portion of our debate. Now, Brenny, how would you like to do this? You want to take this, or you want me to lead off on this one?
You go right ahead.
Okay, let's talk about PC software, because there's some common misconceptions about what was available. I went over, I went over a few of these things, but I wanted to go over them again, just to kind of use these examples in the realm of what I'm talking about. So, I mentioned you can get inexpensive software on the PC, and this is true. Sometimes free. If you are someone that gets online, back in the day, you could download games till the cows came home. And granted, it's various qualities of games, but you could download games that were demos or full games, or games that people had programmed in. So that was always a nice entry, because you're effectively talking about a huge library of free software or shareware software. This really ramped up in the early 90s, but it was around in the 80s, in the late 80s too, and so there was a pretty decent selection of stuff. I mentioned BBSing, which again was a big facet of it. I want to talk about games that you could play on the PC that you could never play on a console. So, right off the gate, if you look at the NES Golden Seal, the standard that they supposedly held their programmers to, or the companies that made software for the NES, the PC was a completely wide open expanse with literally no rules about what you could or couldn't do. Now, does this mean you got some crummy games? Sometimes, yes. Absolutely. But you got crummy games on the NES. But what you also got on the PC that you couldn't get on the NES were games that had controversial topics. They had adult topics. They had over-the-top violence, or sometimes just normal violence that Nintendo didn't approve of. So this opened up a whole different area of gaming that you could not get on a console. Something else, as I mentioned, with the ability to have a keyboard involved. I know Brent said he didn't like playing games with a keyboard, but I liked it. And what you did was you had the ability to play games that you could never really play properly on a console. And I don't just mean Infocom games. I mean games that require, like flight simulators, for example, or even games that required multiple keys to shortcut commands. I'll use 688 Attack Sub as an example of a game where you could use the keyboard shortcuts to go through the game quicker. I think the keyboard opens up a whole world of gaming that you could not get on NES. It also opens up the world to multiplayer games, because even without joysticks, most games that supported your keyboard would support that had multiplayer. It would have multiple players on the keyboard. It was no problem. We did that tons and tons of times back in the day. I want to talk about the ability to save games. This was a much more prominent feature back in the day. It happened a lot more than it would. This is something that would come later on down the life of a Nintendo machine, but it wasn't as prevalent on the NES. And this is an unsavory topic. I'm just going to throw it out there. One thing you could do on the PC that you could never do on the Nintendo, not for years, was for straight up pirate games. You could you could go copy your buddy's floppy. You could go download games. PC games were smaller, and I mean by today's standards. And I remember even on I think it was on like a 28.8 or a 14.4 modem, you could download a floppy disk in an hour or so without any difficulty, and it was easy as pie to do, and you got a free game. Now, should you pirate games? No, but that didn't stop most people, and so what you could do was build up a robust library of software. Now it's kind of crummy, but you could do it. And when you did it, you had the game, free game. So there's an aspect of PC gaming that you wouldn't think of today, but it was a pretty big deal to be able to download whatever game you wanted. I didn't want to go through a huge list of PC games that I used to play, but I did grab some just to use as a few examples and why it was a good way to go. We're looking at games up to 89, and there were a lot of good games that came out before 87. And just a few I wanted to mention were, you had the Space Quest series, if you were into those games. You had the Sim City that came out in 89, which is a great game. These are games that would be very difficult to do in a console environment. The entire Infocom library of text games, which you use the keyboard to type in commands. I want to mention the Arkanoid series, Arkanoid and Revenge of Doe, which came out in 86, 89 respectively, which used the mouse peripheral to a great degree for control. Games that had PAL or analog features, the mouse was a boon for. I want to talk about games like Battle Chess and 688 Attack Sub, which lets you play over the modem with like a network style game. Now, Battle Chess came out for the NES, but it didn't come out for 2 more years and did not have that feature. So you had games like that. I want to talk about some games like Microsoft Flight Simulator. That series of games, again, could not ever appear on a console due to the girth of controls that you had to use. The Leisure Suit Larry series, another series that would have to be heavily edited to appear on a console. So you can see that quite a few of these would just never appear on a console. There's a ton of good games. I'm going to surrender the floor to Brent here, and if we get into going game by game, then we'll come back to them. But, Mech Warrior, another great game that you could not ever do on a console because of the keyboard. So, in conclusion, on the software side, lots of great games, free games, more complicated games, and just games that were a lot of fun, Brent. What do you think?
PC gaming during this era, it was the Wild West of gaming. There's no question about it. You definitely could get your more unsavory titles to the PC route. The unfortunate problem is they all looked horrible. During this era, really what you wanted to do was get to as close to the arcade as you could. That was one of the main goals. And the 16 color, while respectable for some games, was just ugly for others. But I'm not going to harp on that because graphics is not everything to a game. And I've never thought that. And there are certainly some 16 color games out there that are beautiful. So, I'm not even going to totally go down that route. The problem with PC gaming during this time, first of all, was availability. You couldn't go into a lot of stores and pick up a game like you could for Nintendo. The availability for Nintendo stuff was way larger. Also, you could walk into a rental place and rent games for the consoles, and you could never do that for the PC. At least nowhere around here that I ever saw. That allowed you to sample a game, decide if it was something you wanted legally, and then make a purchase decision off of that. Also, with PC gaming, you're talking about, the keyboard's this great input device. Yes. No, it's not. It is very limiting. It forces you to learn a bunch of commands that sometimes make sense and sometimes doesn't. And when you're trying to use a keyboard to emulate a controller, you run into key clashes. You run into just the inability to do simple techniques, rolling techniques, become a chore on a keyboard versus a controller. But we're talking about software. So you're talking about these games that were available on PC that you can never do on Nintendo. And when I go over my games, I'm going to show you that's just not true. Outside of text adventures, which you could still do, but why would you want to on a console? Everything plays better on a console. Everything. And I'll get on, like I said, I'll get into that more when we show my games off. But you have to understand the availability for downloading shareware and getting previews of your games was not prevalent in this time. It was just not. Now, could you go and borrow your buddy's game? Sometimes, yeah, if you had compatible systems. But you couldn't go and just pick up all the games that you're talking about, you're wanting to play. They weren't just out there. They never were out there like that.
Mm-hmm. I disagree. You could, first of all, there were plenty of places selling PC titles. Second off, yes.
I didn't say there wasn't. I said the availability wasn't as strong.
I'd say it was as strong. Secondly, you got to think PC titles had been out a lot longer than the NES, so there were titles out there, and major retailers carry PC software in this era. And you're talking about an era here with like your EBs and your there were stores.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. When you walked in and you had the Nintendo shelf, there were 70 games. When you looked at the PC shelf, there were like 10.
That's not true. In fact, it's the exact opposite.
I completely disagree. I vividly remember walking into stores.
The ratio changed and PC did get squeezed out. There's no doubt. But at this time, there was still plenty of shelf space for PC titles. Big box titles. Why do you think they had big boxes? They were big box titles on a big shelf. I think the keyboard's a perfectly legitimate interface device. I think the mouse. I think you're understating the abilities the mouse gave you to do analog type controls. I think that it gave you a lot of nice action. Also, again, with the 16 color graphics and the three channel sound, the Tandy had real good looking games. I mean, much better looking than CGA. That's for darn sure. I think there were plenty of games available online. I know you're a little fuzzy in this era. I mean, you couldn't even remember that we actually owned the Tandy TL. So I know
it's because it's so unmemorable.
I don't expect you to remember what was going on, but yes, there were plenty of things to download game wise. That of all sorts of genres, and also we'll get to this later. But no, I don't agree that the consoles could do everything the PC could do better. We'll talk about that when right now, I guess. Because why don't you go ahead and give us the scoop on the software side of the NES?
Absolutely. Something I want to, I said I wasn't going to harp on the 16 color graphics, but you brought it, the 16 color, you brought it up again, so now I've got to. When you're comparing graphics from a console of this era to a computer of this era, it's not even fair. Obviously, the games for Nintendo looked better than was ever producible on a 16 color palette. But that's not even what I want to get into. You're talking about games that you couldn't play anywhere else. That's where Nintendo first-party license is its strongest. Because they were pumping out games, high-quality games, that you couldn't get for the PC because they wouldn't sell them for the PC. I'm talking about your Marios, your Zeldas, all of these first-party titles that were completely exclusive, not only away from PC, but away from other consoles at this time. These were games everyone was wanting to play, and the sales numbers back that up. When you are looking at sales numbers for this time period, some of the highest selling games of all time were on Nintendo. For example, Super Mario Brothers has over 40 million copies sold. That puts it like in the top 10 of all time. Now you can say, oh, that was included with the system. That kind of bumped the numbers. It sold systems. And I can't think of a single PC title that sold PCs. Now it might be out there, and I hope you can correct me. But there were plenty of games that sold systems. You've got your Mario Brothers, you've got your Mario Brothers 3, you've got your Legends of Zelda, you've got your Punch-Out, your Metroids, and even into the realm of places you don't think PCs or consoles can go. You've got your flight simulators, you've got your arcade flight simulators, you've got your role-playing games, and I'm talking about games that are epic adventures that are 20, 30, 40 hours long in your Ultimas and your Dragon Quest, and even titles that are sim-based. SimCity, in my opinion, is probably best played on the NES because of the added features that it has. You've got your sports titles. You've got your licensed sports titles at that. Something that was hardly ever done on the PC during this era. And you've got games that were experimental. Games that were not of the norm. I'm talking games that use peripherals like Rob the Robot, even though he wasn't a great boon to the system. He was obviously a marketing gimmick. It was still something that you could play on Nintendo that you could absolutely not play anywhere else. And you can't just say they had just big titles, because they had lots of indie smaller titles too. They had stuff like Bible Adventure, for goodness sakes, that wasn't licensed through Nintendo. So those things did happen. Nintendo's grasp wasn't so mighty that it wiped out all these other things. They were possible. They just weren't done because they weren't necessary. When you're looking at sound, the Nintendo has great sound. It had music while having sound effects. It had strong showings in the sound department on some games that you can't even play because they're copyrighted music now. They actually turned them into CDs, which is something that I don't know if ever happened on the PC. Even your point-and-click adventures, your Maniac Mansions, your games like that, they played great on console. And until you've actually tried it, where the mouse pointer will actually scroll nicely to what you're trying to do, and you can have snap controls, and certain commands are just already mapped to the buttons in certain games, it makes it easier, it makes it faster. And it wasn't just a few titles that had that, it was a lot of titles. It also went into the realm of 3D gaming, where you actually wore your red and blue glasses. Games like Rad Racer had that feature. And it was it a gimmick? Some people can say that was a gimmick, sure, but it wasn't what made the game. Rad Racer, for example, sold almost 2 million copies. 2 million. So it's not like that one little feature was a gimmick. The whole game was good, and it had this extra feature. So I am hard pressed when you look at arcade titles, all the arcade titles that it did so well. I'm hard pressed to see how you could think that gaming on a Nintendo was not something to be done for everyone.
Well, just a little bit of disagreement here. First of all, just right off the top, anyone, and you're not even naive enough to try to get this over, no one's going to say that moving an arrow around the screen with a controller is as good as a mouse, because it's not.
I will. In
There's
fact,
no way.
I would play Maniac Mansion on a NES before I'd play it on a computer.
You know, it's funny let's talk about Maniac Mansion on the NES, shall we? Since we actually covered that in a previous episode. What's the big flagrant issue with Maniac Mansion on the NES? It was censored, heavily censored.
Was it heavily censored?
Yes or no? Was it heavily censored?
It was minorly censored.
It was heavily censored. A lot of games on the NES are censored. So you have to play ball with the juggernaut tyrant that Nintendo was back in the day. Nintendo decided how many games you could make. They made all the cartridges. They put the lockout chip in to make sure no one else could do it. And yeah, the Bible game being an offshoot, effectively a pirate outlaw cartridge, hardly anyone has those. They're super incredibly rare.
Well, there's also Tension did the same thing.
Everyone had to play the game that Nintendo wanted. And what that meant was Nintendo could mold that library to however they wanted. And that seal of quality that they stamped on stuff didn't mean jack squat. It was the seal of money is what it was. They wanted to make all the money on all the software. And so it was limiting. You don't get the more risque titles, more violent titles. Plus, if I played Maniac Mansion on the PC and rolled over to Nintendo to play it, and all of a sudden I'm finding that things aren't the same, that's lame, man. To go in there and edit software like that is incredibly lame. That didn't happen on the PC because it didn't have to happen. Nintendo was very restrictive with what they would let you do on their machines. So because again they made all the cartridges, so they would basically make these parties limit how many games they can make a year. So not only were they making money on getting all the cartridge action, they were also making sure that your Konamis and your Capcoms, all those guys could only make a certain amount of games per year. That also was limiting on what was released. So, but that all their draconian cartridge limiting aside, I'm not going to sit here and stupidly say that none of the Nintendo games are great. They've got tons and tons of classic titles on here. But I would submit to you that there's a flip side, there's a opposite side of the coin to a lot of these titles. Let's take a look at the Zelda series, for example, which everyone loves the Zelda series. It's not my bag, but I can understand people like it. The PC had its own flavor of role-playing. That was a whole different level of role-playing. It was a whole different type of role-playing. And I'm talking, it's like the Gold Box series. I looked at what was released in the late 80s, and you got quite a few really good role-playing games. I mean, you got your Might and Magic, which eventually the NES got it, but it was like literally 5 or 6 years later. You know, your Pools of Radiance, the Gold Box game. When you talk about flight simulators on the NES, that made me laugh too. I saw Top Gun fly by. You're going to compare that to Microsoft Flight Simulator or their finest hour?
I said that was an arcade flight simulator.
You said both. I'm just saying the complexity, the realism on their finest hour or 6A Attack Sub is like 1,000% higher than what you're going to get on the NES. The Curse of Azure Bonds is another great game that you could not get on the NES, these were more involved Dungeons and Dragons style role-playing games, the stuff that a tabletop gamers were used to. A game like Zelda, to me, and I've not played Dragon Warrior, so I can't comment, but I mean, to call, I don't know what, I know Bode always fights with me that whether or not this is a role-playing game, but I mean, it's often thrown up as a role-playing game, but I mean, really, what is it? It's a game where you run around whacking bushes with a sword for 20 hours. Not my bag, man. I want to go into dungeons and fight actual dragons and stuff with a party. It's the way it's supposed to be done. The PC gave you the ability with the keyboard control to go through and customize your games, name your characters, go through and have shortcut keys to get all the stuff done you needed to run a proper RPG. I think the PC really shined on games like that. Simulation and RPG is where the PC shone far above the NES. Your Bard's Tales, your games like that. Those are games that they shined on. Plus, you didn't have to worry about Nintendo going in there and monkeying with them. It's a big
your
deal.
ignorance is showing through here. Because Nintendo had the Dragon Quest, it had the Ultimas, it had the Final Fantasies, and these are all of your, and I'm not talking one or two of these games, they had 3, 4, 5 of the same series, different chapters of the games, which is all your traditional turn-based stat RPGs.
So, Jeff,
so
first of all,
it's covered.
Ultima on the NES, that sounds like a disaster. I'll take Ultima on the PC where that's where it was made to go. And Final Fantasy, these are Japanese RPGs. They're not the same.
No, these aren't all Japanese RPGs. These are
Zelda,
RPGs.
Dragon Quest, and Final Fantasy are all Japanese.
Okay, first of all, okay, you're right. I guess if we can narrow down a subject to its finite grain of sand, you might get something that's better on a PC. But I'm not going to give you that for RPGs. Because RPGs for the Nintendo, let me run a few numbers by you. Dragon Quest 3, almost 4 million copies. Dragon Quest 4, over 3 million copies. Dragon Quest 2, almost 2.5 million copies. And then you've got your Final Fantasy games have sold millions of copies. So these are games that people were choosing to play on the NES because it was accessible, it was easy, the stories were good, and it was a great way to play RPGs.
I agree. A lot of little kids got their
this has nothing to do with little kid stuff, and you're showing your ignorance when you say that kind of thing.
The NES had a rep for being the kiddie console. That's what it was. It shipped with a freaking robot, man.
No,
the PC
you're
was
showing your
someone
ignorance.
That had sophisticated taste. They had to know what a PC was, for example. They had to be able to come home from work and sit down and work on this thing. These aren't people that came staggering in from 3rd grade and wanted to play a role-playing game, and they got there and they went into this. The PC was for people that were a little more sophisticated, a little more going on. That's the difference. I'm not saying they didn't sell in big numbers, but a lot of people watch the Kardashians too.
You're showing your ignorance. You're saying that, oh, it's a kiddie game. Some of the most brutal things I've ever seen came from a Nintendo game. Bionic Commando. You kill Hitler, and his head explodes, and he curses on screen.
I think we could all get behind that. There's no doubt.
Okay, so kiddie console, or were there games aimed at children? Sure, but you've had that on PC as well. But there were definitely as many adult-oriented, adult subject. I'm not talking XXX. I'm talking adult themes, complex themes in your role-playing games on Nintendo. So thinking otherwise, just you're ignorant.
I disagree.
Is Legend of Zelda a role-playing game? No, it's an action-adventure game.
That's what Bode says too. Hey, I'm just saying. And you can't deny this. In fact, it's not even a debate here. There are different types of role-playing games on the consoles than on the PCs.
You're right.
And they have totally different flavors.
The console has better ones in almost every regard.
I don't agree with that. So I think we'll leave it there, Brent. A rousing fight and argument. We will leave it to the gentle viewers to and listeners to decide which side of the coin they want to come down on. If you want to leave comments below the video, or feel free to email us, and we will get our email address up here momentarily. But we would love to hear from you. We'd like Discord comments, anything you've got on your take, and for that matter, who you think put up a better argument, just so we can have bragging rights, Brent. Speaking of bragging rights, I have no segue to get us to the wheel. There we go. Okay, man. Now, this week, we've added 2 things. So, for our classic console, we've got the Mega Drive. And for our new piece, we've got the VTech Socrates, which I just picked one of these up. So
That's so great. And that is solely on there because you now own one,
That's
isn't
right.
it?
You got that right. Here we go. And we have a winner. And the winner is Food Games, Brent. Food Games.
Food games. Oh, excellent.
Food games. We've got to do games related to food. That's kind of neat, isn't it, Brent?
I think this is a good broad topic.
I agree. I actually enjoyed that battle. It opened my eyes to a few things, and just to be fair, in closing, I own a NES and have several favorite games on it. Of course, I've owned a PC my whole life, and so have you. So, but still, I think we picked the right sides on that because we both have our own taste, given our age, as it goes.
Real quick, let's talk about food games.
Yeah.
We are doing games that are themed around food. That's going to be the restriction?
Right. Or you are food in the game, or something. There's got to be food involved. Some sort of and human food.
I'm not going to pick Burger Time,
right?
But I'm definitely going to talk about Burger Time.
You've already picked Burger Time in a previous show, so you don't get to pick it again. Remember our electronic handheld game show? What a dud, by the way. You picked poorly in that one. Hey, we'd like to...
You're insane. Burger Time's great.
We'd like to do a quick shout-out to our good buddy, the Dunkster, Duncan Styles, who does our awesome 3D Tron-like graphics. We'd also like to shout-out to our good buddy, the Bark Bit, who does our cool closing theme. Brent, you want to say hi to anybody in the chat there? Anybody stick around?
Looks like my lovely wife is angry that you're not letting me pick Burger Time for a second time.
Yeah, she loves Burger Time. I know that.
We got Pep Blau.
Well said.
We've got Wing Chung Wolf.
Oh, yeah.
Duncan Styles. Paul Kitching. Pixels. I know Roushie was here in the beginning, but he had to take off. Buck Owen. I'm sure I'm missing people.
Poor Rushi.
Hey, I'm in chat.
Yeah, Rushi's on.
So yeah, we had a pretty good crowd turnout.
He has to kick out because it's so late over there in Germany.
Geo's Lake's on.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Hey, we'd like to thank you for showing up. Again, we record every Sunday at 9 a.m. sharp, unless we're late, which I think
not sharp. Dull's a blade.
We were pretty close. Brent, any parting thoughts before we put this thing to bed?
I am looking forward to food games next week. I think it'll be a fun episode.
Great. Please, if you have any comments, questions, contact us at argpresents@mail.com. We would love to hear from you. We're always happy to get any iTunes reviews. You can catch our show on YouTube or on Anchor. If that's your bag, all of our shows are available on Anchor. We'd like to thank our Anchor sponsors. Brent, you want to thank your Anchor sponsors here? He doesn't. He doesn't want to thank the Anchor. He looks like a deer in headlights, man.
Oh, I thought you were talking about our...
You're out of your mind.
I thought you were talking about the people we do the ad for.
No.
I was like, no, I don't want to thank them.
No. Idiot. Your Anchor sponsors. Thank your Anchor sponsors.
I'm actually going to do something special for our Anchor sponsors moving forward. I'm going to try to put together a little thing where we not only where we read out the names, but we try to give them a little special I don't.
You gonna sing
Skit?
for him?
Oh no, I'm not gonna sing because that's already a done thing.
Well, I'll go ahead, since you don't have anything, I'll go ahead and thank them, our good buddy Anthony Jarvis and John Schaller. We'll try to do better next time, buddy, since you weren't sold on this one. We'll see if we can crank something up more. I think food games is probably something he came up with. It sounds like one of his, so we will try to get it right. Hey, listen, we do appreciate everybody tuning in, and we will catch you on the flip side next week for food games. Until then, I'm right, he's wrong.